It looks like attendees are arriving. Hello, everyone. We're going to wait a couple minutes to have some people trickle in, and then we'll get started. All right, so we have some attendees here. I'm sure some people will continue to pop into the room as we get going, but I don't want to waste any time because this is going to be a great conversation today. So hello, everybody. Welcome to the American Constitution Society's panel on restorative justice. This event is hosted by the ACS at-large lawyer chapter, the Bay Area lawyer chapter, the Oregon lawyer chapter, the Filipino Bar Association of Northern California, and the Columbia Law School ACS student chapter. My name is Alex. I'm a 2L at Columbia and part of the ACS chapter there. And just as a brief introduction to the American Constitution Society, for those of you that don't know, ACS is a progressive legal organization with student and lawyer chapters all over the country. We have a nice group of people coming together to host today. And we work to promote the values of equity and equality, justice expressed in the Constitution, and try to ensure that everybody has equal access to those values. So I'm really excited to be here moderating this panel, and I'm excited to hear today's conversation, and thank you all for coming, and thank you to the speakers for agreeing to chat with us today. So first, I'll take some time to introduce each speaker, and then we'll take some time to hear from each of you about your work with restorative justice, what restorative justice means to you, and then we'll enter a Q&A. So that includes questions from the audience. If the audience does not mind submitting questions using the Q&A feature on Zoom, I'll receive those questions, and I am more than happy to send those along to the panelists to answer questions during the second part of the presentation. So getting started, I will introduce our panelists today. Our first panelist, Judge Abby Abenanti, is the Chief Judge for the Yurok Tribal Court in Klamath, California, and an enrolled member of the Yurok tribe. Judge Abby has previously presided by appointment over the Shoshone-Bannock Tribal Court, the Hopi Tribal Court, and the Colorado River Indian Tribal Court. She's also served as Chief Magistrate of the Court of Indian Offenses for the Hoopa Valley Indian Reservation and as a Court Commissioner for the Superior Court of San Francisco County. In her courtroom, Judge Abby incorporates Yurok approaches to conflict resolution, which aim to involve everybody impacted by an offense, rehabilitate individuals who have caused harm, and provide justice. Judge Abby received her JD from the University of New Mexico School of Law and was the first Indigenous woman to pass the California bar and the first Indigenous woman to become a state judge. She has taught at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law and at Stanford Law School. In 2020, the Indian Law section of the Federal Bar Association recognized her with its Lawrence R. Baca Lifetime Achievement Award for her advocacy and policy work. Our next panelist, Professor Lara Bazelon, is a professor of law, the Barnett Chair in Trial Advocacy, and the Director of the Criminal, Juvenile Justice, and Racial Justice Clinical Programs at the University of San Francisco School of Law. From 2012 to 2015, she was a Visiting Associate Clinical Professor at Loyola Law School and the Director of the Loyola Law School Project for the Innocent. Professor Bazelon also served as a trial attorney in the Office of the Federal Public Defender in Los Angeles after she received her JD from New York University School of Law. She's a contributing writer for Slate and Politico magazine, where she writes on topics including the issues arising from wrongful convictions. Her essays and op-eds have also been published in the New York Times, Washington Post, Atlantic, San Francisco Chronicle, and Los Angeles Times, and she's the author of a book titled Rectify: The Power of Restorative Justice After Wrongful Conviction, which was published in October 2018. Professor Bazelon's writing seeks to illuminate systemic breakdowns in the criminal justice system and to open readers' minds to collaboration, mutual understanding, and creative problem solving. Our third panelist, Councilmember Ray Buenaventura, is a council member for Daly City, California. He's been a council member since 2011 and has also served as mayor and vice mayor of Daly City. As council member, he serves on the Social Justice Committee and is involved with the Restorative Justice Program in Daly City. Councilmember Buenaventura has over 25 years of experience as a trial attorney. He is a certified criminal law specialist with expertise in defending clients facing felony, misdemeanor, and juvenile criminal charges. From 2011 to 2013, he was the executive director of the Santa Clara County Youth Courts Program, where he led the groundwork and developed the training program for the county's first restorative justice program for youths. He served on the California State Bar Criminal Law Advisory Commission from 2011 to 2014, and currently serves on the California State Bar Attorney Discipline Commission. Councilmember Buenaventura received his JD from the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, and teaches at San Francisco State University. So thank you so much and welcome to all three of our amazing speakers. And without further ado, I think we should get started hearing from each of you about your work with restorative justice. If there's no objection, we can go in the order that I introduced you, if that works for everybody. So Judge Abby, take it away. Thank you. Judge Abby, it looks like you're muted still.
Some of my best work is when I'm muted, I have to say. But in any event, thank you all for joining us. And, you know, I'm always taken by people naming things that we've done for thousands of years. And then I have to try to catch up, you know, and I realized after I had come home and been home for a while that people were saying, oh, you're doing restorative justice. And I'm going, what's that? You know, I thought I just went home and did what we used to do. And so that's sort of my approach to how we've set up our system here. My coming home was about setting up an infrastructure at home that would help our people make the transition that we're trying to make. Now, for thousands of years, we lived here, we did well. We had, I don't know how many of you know Yurok's, probably not too many, but I'm sure that we had disputes during those thousands of years. We did not have jails. We did not have, let's consequence somebody into better behavior. We had, why did you do that? And how are we going to fix this? And that's pretty much our value system. And so what my job has been is to look back on our values and then develop practices for our situation today. Now, things changed. We had an invasion. We picked up a lot of bad habits from the invaders, and now we're here today. So how are we going to address those? And for us, the way we address it is to look at our value system and then develop practices from that, so that we have about 6,500 members. We have a court staff of close to 50 people. And you go, what in the world are they doing? Well, what in the world they're doing is they're doing a lot of community outreach, and they walk with people as those people try to walk back to the right way to do things as a Yurok human. You know, we're not a rights-based society or culture. We are a responsibility-based culture. And what that means is if you have not met your responsibilities, you have to correct and meet your responsibilities. And you have people help you do that. You don't get born with knowing what all your responsibilities are. You know, whether it's responsibilities to family, to clans, to dance families, to the environment. Those are all things that we need to interlace together to walk forward. And that's essentially what we've done. So we don't allow humongous caseloads because the person has to be available who is the helper. So essentially what we've said is, look, you're going to go out there and we're going to call you a wellness worker. And what your job is what our traditional jobs used to be. Aunts and uncles did the primary teaching of skill sets about how you exercise your responsibilities. So that's what I expect you to do. I expect you to teach people how to do that and to interface with them, to go to their homes. They can come to your home, to go to events. And when they need help, to help them do it, whatever it is. And, I don't, when I first came home, people would say things like, oh, you can't do that. Laura, you can't be her judge. I'm like, there is not a person that's going to walk into this courtroom that I don't know. I may not recognize you because you guys all grow up on me when I'm not paying attention, but I know you and I know your families. So we did this for thousands of years. How do you think we did it? We either had no disagreements, not likely, or we managed to work our way through this differently than what you've seen on TV. And maybe TV isn't really a good model for doing how we live, and they would go, okay, well, how are we going to do this? And I'm saying, okay, we have all these offenses. Do you guys want trials? Because we'd have a whole courtroom full of people. Or do you want to just talk to me and try to straighten this out? Nobody wanted trials. And nobody realized that they were making the cultural choice. That's what was kind of funny, is that they thought that's what they wanted to do. So they wanted to talk to me and figure out what to do and tell me why they did it and see if that was okay or not. And sort of the perfect example of this is somebody goes, well, both of you, your cousins, you both got your nets and your fish taken because you left your nets in too long. And that's hundreds of dollars worth of fines and losing your fish and your net, which is also hundreds of dollars. So I say to the first person, why did you do that? Well, I did it because I forgot to charge my phone and my alarm didn't go off. I said, okay, so you're just done. And I said to the second guy, why did you do it? He said, well, because they couldn't find my cousin and he was supposed to help my auntie take her net out. I know his auntie is elderly. So I said, okay, so you're not in trouble. You did what you should have. I'm giving you back your net and your fish. I said, and you owe him a head slap because he obviously got you into a lot of trouble. So then I turned to the first guy and I said, how are you going to make this right? I said, you can have your nets back if you want to pay a couple $100 in fines. I said, or to make up for it, you could bring fish to the dance this weekend. And he said, oh, I would do that. I would bring fish to the dance. And I said, okay, then I'm going to give you back your net and the fish that you have, which I already gave to the elders, are gone. But you can do this other. And then he said, well, how will you know if I do it? And I said, I'll know if you do it because I will be at the dance. And if you don't do it, you're going to have a really rotten Monday. He said, well, I was going to do it. I was just wondering. I said, well, it's good to wonder. I said, okay, we all good? Yeah, okay. And that's the end of it. And that pretty much is the approach, because people would say at first, well, I don't know if I should talk to you. It's all about their right to silence. And I said, well, look at it this way. We all have elders. And when they ask you a question, are you going to tell them you have a right to remain silent? I said, because if you do, I'd be happy to help you put your head back on your shoulders because that's really not going to work for you. And I said, there is not a your grandmother alive who would allow you to get away with that line. So don't try it on me because it's not going to happen for you. That's not how this works. And pretty much that's the point of the story is not so much the fishing, but there's a couple things. One, you gave up sort of the rights to remain silent. And you also set aside the law because yes, that second man, he didn't take his net out and he was supposed to. But what's more important? His auntie is obviously more important culturally. So he did not do the wrong thing. Regardless of what the law stated, he did the right thing. The first guy got the second guy in trouble. So you have to work that out between them. And so it's just a different system and it's very value-based. And I guess for now, I'll stop there because I think what I want to do is give you an example of what the difference is. So every area of our law, that's how it's run. It's like, what mistake did you make? Do you want help fixing it? Let's give you the help you need to fix it. And if you don't know how to fix it, we'll help you fix it.
Hello, everyone. Judge Abby is hard to follow, but I'm going to do my best. I, first of all, appreciate many of the things that she spoke to, including the fact that restorative justice practices are native in origin, and they were practiced long before white people came to the United States and did the things that we did. I come to the topic of restorative justice with a lot of humility because it is really only a term and a practice that I became familiar with within the last maybe 6 or 7 years. And that was because I did a lot of research and spoke to people who were well versed in it for the book that I wrote about how restorative practices can be healing for original crime victims in wrongful conviction cases, and also the people who were wrongfully convicted of those crimes. So we're talking about people who were on opposite sides of the courtroom, the victims, of course, believing that the accused person was the perpetrator, but only to find out that actually the system really, through a lot of machinations and injustice, had gotten the wrong person. And sometimes the victims had unwittingly participated in the wrongful conviction. And so there are organizations that are bringing those two sides, which are really on the same side and victimized in overlapping ways, together through restorative justice. And I thought that was a very interesting idea and way to bring some kind of healing and resolution to a process that had been incredibly harmful for all involved. So that's sort of my academic understanding of it. I did a lot of research for the book, and since then, I've also looked at the use of restorative justice for some of my clients. So I guess I should back up and say that my students at the University of San Francisco School of Law represent people who are accused of various crimes or offenses or disciplinary infractions. And one of the things that we do is we defend students on college and university campuses who are accused of offenses that could get them expelled from school and lose their education. And primarily the cases that we get involved with involve allegations of sexual harassment and sexual assault. So our clients are on the receiving end of those allegations. And what's interesting about these cases, there's many things that are interesting, but one is that following some changes in the federal law in 2020, the schools now are allowed to offer restorative justice to the parties as an option. And as the judge was saying, oftentimes when you say to people in a dispute, people who have been accused, people who have been victimized, do you want this trial? Do you want this adjudicatory process, which in the Title IX situation is some kind of an adversarial hearing and credibility testing, or do you want something else? And the something else is restorative justice. Sometimes the people involved on both sides will want the restorative alternative. And I know that may seem counterintuitive or controversial in a case involving an allegation like sexual assault. In fact, though, what my students and I have found is that process, the adjudicatory process that the schools have set up to try to, I guess, get to the truth and mete out justice, is very traumatizing for everyone involved. And that a lot of times what people who feel that they have been harmed, what they want is an acknowledgement and a validation by the other person. Perhaps the person doesn't completely agree with their version of events, but quite often these are intimate partner dating relationships where the parties know each other and something has gone wrong. And of course, the traditional adjudicatory process, as I'm sure the judge could speak to, incentivizes denial and a kind of binary process whereby one side accuses and the other side denies. And in a restorative process, the focus is on, as the judge was speaking to, what harm was done and how can this be addressed and corrected. And so I guess my more recent experience with it is in the context of this kind of litigation. And I found it to be very eye-opening. And again, I think it's really important to talk about the origins of it. These are not American civilization origins. Our society, Western white civilization thinking about crime and justice is very Judeo-Christian. It's very much about an eye for an eye and about retribution. And restorative justice is talking about something else entirely. And it's been very interesting and affirming to me as someone who has represented many, many accused people in an adjudicatory system to be able to observe and participate in a different kind of process where I feel like both sides on the other side of it don't feel more traumatized or more angry or more bitter, but instead have some sense of validation and healing, excuse me. So with that, I will pass the baton.
Thank you, Professor and Judge Abby, for your really great insights. So I'm going to talk about restorative justice basically on the more government and county and local level. As first mentioned, I started the first peer court program in Santa Clara County in 2011. It was started with an initiative really by the professor I was working for, the dean of the law school I was teaching, where he asked me to start the first peer court program. And so we did. We worked with the probation department, the district attorney, the judges, and the defense bar. And the model was basically what you would think it would be. It was like a courtroom setting. It was limited exclusively to juvenile offenders, and the participants in the program were basically high school students. They played the role of the defense attorney and the prosecutor and the jury. In that particular program, cases were vetted by the probation department, who screened the cases from their department and from the juvenile courts. The idea was basically to have the offender explain his or her story, their crime, and the relevant events that led them to commit the crime itself. It was a chance for the defendant to also show remorse and acceptance of responsibility. More importantly, however, it was the victim who would play a critical role in these kind of programs and who would be present and also express the impact of the crime on them, their families, and their well-being. The jury, as I mentioned, consisted of the young adults who would also determine the punishment. And that ranged from anything from community service, restitution, counseling, and things of that sort. So that was then. That was back in 2011. And now I'm fast forwarding to where I think restorative justice is going today. And that's what I've been setting up here in Daly City, California. I've been the mayor of Daly City for 3 terms. And as mentioned, I served on the Restorative Justice Committee that we started. Now, the Restorative Justice Program that we have in Daly City is going to be a very different model than the one I started in Santa Clara County. The model that I'm trying to see if I can encapsulate it in a phrase, but the model is based similarly on what's been known in other jurisdictions as a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where there will be 5 members of the community who will serve on the commission and who will basically hear from both sides and decide the outcome. The cast of characters in this model will be very different from the traditional model. It won't be in a courtroom setting. There will be no district attorney, no defense attorney, and no judges. It will obviously require victim buy-in and, of course, defendant buy-in. The cases will come directly from the police department. They will initially screen those cases that are non-controversial. For example, vandalism, petty theft, trespass, all misdemeanors, at least in the beginning. What's similar to this model, as opposed to the ones in the past that I've helped create, is the role of the victim and the defendant. They will both address the commission, tell their stories, and the commission will decide their fate. Again, it's all rehabilitative focused. They'll consider socioeconomics, jobs, mental health, substance abuse, and things like that. But the punishment will never be confinement, and it will be based on what the community, the commission believes where the help should be. San Mateo County also is developing a youth program similar to what I've described. Similar idea, but it's going to be exclusively to youth. It will be held at a local boys and girls club with a different cast of characters. And again, the focus is on rehabilitation. Now, here's where I see some of the issues and some of the problems. The biggest, I think, and I hope this gets communicated and shared and talked about, is to change the narrative of what restorative justice means. I think there are still a significant portion of people who think that restorative justice is just a way to escape punishment and that it's basically an easy way out. So we need to change the narrative on that. The other thing is there's resistance to doing restorative justice when the crimes involve violent offenses or even drug sales kind of offenses. So the other issue is that somehow, if you invest in a restorative justice program, that it is considered defunding the police. So that's an issue. And also an issue is obviously the funding itself. Are people, is the government willing to invest the money to find a different way in terms of a different result in trying to do something like a restorative justice program? So convincing people that it works, we have to have data. We have to have data on recidivism. We have to be able to justify the funding, and we need to convince people it's just not a way out, but a real enlightening way, a productive way, a meaningful way to serve justice, both for the victim and for the defendant. So thank you, that's my comment.
Thank you all so much. This has been an excellent start to our conversation. And actually, Councilmember Buenaventura, you segued extremely well into my first question, which was going to be about measuring success. So it's certainly debatable whether or not the traditional system of criminal or justice in general is good at measuring success, but there is a sort of standard way that it is done that is generally accepted. And so I'd love to hear from you all about some potential ways that you could do data collection, that you could measure success in terms of barriers to investment or community engagement with restorative justice.
I think it really comes down to what questions you ask. You know, we're starting to work with UROC data collectors who are trained. We have our first graduate from the PhD program at Harvard in social policy, and I can understand about every other word she says, but what I do get out of it is that they're not asking the right questions, Judge. You've got to make them ask this question. You know, it's sort of like people look at symptoms instead of context. And then they go, okay, this person's doing this kind of behavior. And domestic violence is a perfect example of that, because we have the only state certified perpetrators program that a tribe runs. And we changed its content. And one of the major changes we made was to ask the person to identify the historical trauma that brought violence into their family. Because if you don't know why you're doing something, it's really hard to stop doing it. You know, so you have all these data collectors go, oh, well, this is what they're doing. Yeah, I need to know that. But what I need to know is why they're doing it. You know, and for us, it means they were either involved in the boarding schools, their family was one of the indentured slaves, or their family was present in one of the massacres. That's where violence came into their family. That question has to be asked. And then you go, how do you remediate that? You know, because the behavior and the symptom, you know, I can figure that out, but it doesn't really help me. What I need to do is be able to figure out how to work with them so that they stop that. so that it stops here. You know, and that's the whole difference, is where do you ask the question and how far back do you go, and stop blaming the person who's got that behavior. You know, they know they have that behavior. I know they have that behavior. That's about as helpful as, you know, a root canal when you don't need one. When you need it, yes. Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
So the measurement question is an interesting one. I have two different thoughts about it. With respect to the way that these campus cases are adjudicated, I've been frustrated for an extremely long time with the federal government, and I'll tell you why. They do not, the Office of Civil Rights, which is sort of in charge of making sure that colleges and universities adequately address allegations of harassment and assault, they do not collect data. They do not collect data on outcomes. They do not also collect data on race. And to me, that's extremely important because my clinic represents people of color. And in our experience, although it's anecdotal, there's a disproportionate way in which they are accused, they are found responsible, and they are punished, and they are not routed to alternatives like restorative justice. But I can say that to you, and if you ask me to back it up with data, I wouldn't be able to give you any, because the Department of Justice does not collect this kind of data. And to me, that's shameful and wrong. So it's hard for me to tell you, okay, I can show you that, you know, these cases, this number resolved successfully through this route, and victim offender satisfaction was X versus Y, because I don't have any data other than my own experience in the system over 3 years, and that's not statistically significant. What I can tell you is that when you use restorative justice alternatives widely, and generally that happens outside of the United States, like in New Zealand, in the Netherlands, in South Africa, and you compare recidivism rates within communities. So you're looking at two groups of people, and they are statistically significant. You're looking at people who went through an adjudicatory process, or you're looking at people who went through a restorative process, and you're looking at reoffender levels. The level of reoffense is far, far lower for people who went through a restorative process instead of an adjudicatory process. And I think this really speaks to the concern raised by the council member and pushing back against the narrative that he rightly says characterizes restorative justice as an excuse or being soft on crime, et cetera. But actually, if you care about public safety, what you really care about is it not happening again. What you care about is people understanding the root causes of their behavior in the way that the judge was speaking to, and uncovering and probing these past harms and traumas, and reaching a greater understanding of their own behavior in a way that's going to lead them to not make the same mistakes moving forward. The final thing I'll say about data collection is that we have two small examples here in the United States. One is through an organization called Common Justice that works with the district attorney's office in Brooklyn, and they divert violent offenders. So these are people who've been accused of shootings, maiming, stabbings, violent assaults. And they say to them, you can have an adjudicatory process or you can have restorative justice. These are overwhelmingly young men of color. They choose the restorative process. And the recidivism rates are so much lower. I mean, very, very, very much lower, to the point where it's of enormous statistical significance. Now, that's one program in one county, but I think it's certainly worth thinking about when you go back to the concern again expressed by the council member about how we shouldn't use restorative justice for these kinds of offenses, that it's only okay for, you know, playground roughhousing or what have you. And then the final example is that there was a program in Pima County, Arizona, that was designed primarily for people accused of sexual assault, misdemeanors and felonies. And they did do an empirical study, the people who set up this program in cooperation with the DA's office. And once again, they found that the recidivism rates were lower and the victim satisfaction was higher. So that's basically what I can tell you about my knowledge of measurement and statistics, which to some degree, unfortunately, is anecdotal. And what I think means is that, first of all, we need more rigorous data collection. And also we need broader acceptance of restorative practices so that we can have statistically significant samples.
So I absolutely agree with the professor and what the judge had said. But in addition to that, I think we need to explore other data. Obviously, recidivism is probably the most important, but I think that we need to find out if we can develop data and statistics on things like, for example, has a student's grades gone up? Has the person's job skills and employment gone up? Have we seen an increase in community service and development? Have we seen an increase in counseling participation or community participation? Have we seen an increase in mental health services because of these programs? Have we seen an increase in substance abuse counseling programs, treatment? I think because these restorative justice issues might take a while to develop, we still would have the statistics about people participating in the outcomes of the restorative justice program. So if we can disaggregate the data, if you will, and let people know that look what's happening, people are bettering themselves because of what the program we developed. And if we can present that, we can ask for more acceptance of the program, certainly ask for more funding, because that's, I think, really where it's at. And we shouldn't forget the importance of what they're going to consider when they decide to allocate funds. Do we really have the data to back it up? Thank you.
I just want to add one thing. One of the highest groups in terms of graduation from college rates are those people who come from Project Rebound, which is prison college, and then get out and go to college. And their graduation rate is something like 97% from college, which changes their lives. You know, so people just aren't looking at the right kinds of things, you know, and it's constant, and how they interlay, you know. And we were going back to the domestic violence project. You know, we had some failures in the beginning. We were trying to figure it out, why people weren't doing their probation, why they weren't doing their 52-week program. And I looked at it and looked at it and looked at it, and I realized, wait a minute. And I set my probation officer up there and I said, you ask each one of those guys if they can read and write. I said, because I know these guys, I don't think they can. And they'd rather go to jail rather than tell me they can't do their homework. And that's exactly what it was. You know, so it's all about how all of these systems combine to crush people. You know, and if you, like us, have the highest dropout rate from elementary school, you're going to have problems with some of the rest of your life. That's just the nature of the beast.
Thank you. I just want to remind participants that you are free to ask questions using the Q&A feature. I will be able to see them, or I think all of us will be able to see them and answer those live here. In the meantime, I do have another question. You have all mentioned sort of all of the interlocking factors and systems that go into some of the challenges and some of the really beneficial parts of restorative justice. I'm somebody who wants to do public defense, criminal defense in my career. And I have been noticing, as a lot of people have, that holistic defense is sort of a more popular thing in public defense communities now, thinking about, you know, the whole person, taking into account a bunch of different factors that might be impacting somebody's client's life. So I guess this is two questions. So what some day-to-day things are that judges and litigators in the traditional non-tribal American legal system can use to challenge the traditional approach that incentivizes adversarial approaches, like Professor Baslan said, and incentivizes denial. What are some day-to-day ways that people in that system can sort of work to change and move to a restorative justice approach? And then also, is restorative justice a kind of all or nothing concept, or are there isolated values that can be implemented without completely changing everything about existing systems?
Well, you know, we're setting up programs to divert from the criminal justice system back to the tribal court so that we can work with people on an individual basis. And then we have very lengthy interview processes about their life and where they've been, where they're going, what's happening, what their family is, what their cultural ties are, what their cultural knowledge is, and so we work on all of those things. And I think the whole concept in this country of, okay, we're going to be a melting pot, which means you're going to give up your culture at the border, was one of our less brilliant approaches, because people, that's where people get their strength from. And they need to be tied back into that so they have a belief system to be built on. It's not just tribal people, it's all people. You come from somewhere, you are something, you have people, you have ancestors. What do they want you to do here? And how do you make that work? And so we've signed our first agreement, and we're going to take a lot of our people out of the criminal system in terms of the after jurisdiction. And if they're successful, then go back and deal with their criminal record. And we got some of that from Project Root and Rebound, which has worked in California to work with offenders and help them clean up their records and move forward. And that's been really eye-opening for us as to how do you do that? How do you deal with a mistake? And how do you get back on your feet? If you can. I mean, the sort of classic example in California, which everybody should be totally annoyed with, is that the firefighters that came out of prisons, they are the first on the line in the fires, but yet when they get out of prison because they were felons, they couldn't be firefighters. That kind of brilliance is about, it's sort of like banging your head against a wall. I mean, it took us years to get that legislative change. Now, exactly how dumb is that?
So, speaking from kind of inside the adjudicatory system, the criminal justice system, I have reason to feel hopeful. And I say that because when I became a federal public defender in 2001, there was no alternative to the adjudicatory process. It was either you can take this plea offer or you can go to trial. That was pretty much it. I mean, there was a little bit maybe of diversion occasionally, but it didn't involve any sort of programming. And 20 years later, when I go to state court in Northern California, what I see are a number of these problem-solving courts, these courts that are about, there's a young adult court, there's a behavioral mental health court. There are courts that are designed not to be adversarial and to really problem solve. There isn't a restorative justice court. I think that would be a pretty amazing and necessary development, but there is a realization more and more that at least in certain cases, that kind of resolution is more appropriate because, again, it's looking at the root causes of what's behind an offense, whether it's abuse, whether it's mental illness, whether it's substance abuse, housing insecurity, economic insecurity, et cetera. And what you have is the judge and the prosecutor and the public defender or the defense counsel coming together to try to craft alternatives that are really going to support the person and advance public safety by putting in place various supports that make it less likely that there'll be a new offense. So when I look at that system now, and I kind of look at it, having been in it on the federal side in Los Angeles 2 decades ago, I really do see a lot of progress, and I see a movement away from thinking that the solution to every offense is jail and prison, and also just a movement away from a binary type of thinking in which someone who commits an offense and someone who's a victim of offense have nothing in common, when in fact they often have a lot in common, come from the same communities, and have suffered many of the same problems. I'm not saying that things are perfect. They're not. We still have mass incarceration. We still have a system that is dominated by systemic racism. And we still have a default approach that all too often finds the answer in locking people up just so we don't have to look at them or think about them anymore. But we are also worlds away from the courtrooms that I litigated in the early 2000s. And so I do think for folks like you who are interested in practicing public defense, it's a much more holistic, diverse practice. And I kind of mean that in every sense in the word, not just the people who are going into it and the decision makers, but also the options that are going to be available to the people that you're representing.
So I agree, and Alex, I will tell you that your interest and also your view of a holistic approach is absolutely necessary. I mean, I'm a public defender, and I learned very early on that the criminal case, although the primary issue, brings with it a whole slew of other issues, and that could range from immigration to family and custody, to tenant eviction, to mental health. There's just because someone has a criminal case doesn't mean it stops and ends with just that. It actually opens up a whole series of issues that, as the attorney, you're going to be faced and confronted with. And they're going to turn to you to find a solution because you're their attorney and they are hoping you have some answers for them. And so what I'm trying to get at is in crafting a solution to what, for lack of a better term, punishment should be, I think more attention needs to be focused on those holistic avenues and broaden the scope of what can be done to help someone going through the criminal justice system. It's still very hard to get people to understand and be convinced that you need to address these other issues too, if you really want to have an impact and move away from punitive matters and more towards rehabilitation and trying to set the course right for that defendant, for their family, and ultimately, hopefully, for the society. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions from the audience. I will read them both, I suppose, and then you can answer whichever or both as you'd like. So one question is, have any of you worked with schools to avoid the school to prison pipeline using restorative justice? And I guess just generally the role of education. And then also, should the goals of restorative justice focus on making people whole for injustices occurring generations ago, creating prospective relief like constitutional adjudication, or both, or something else? Your thoughts on the ultimate goals of restorative justice?
We have a cultural officer in the court now, and one of their first jobs is to go out to the elementary schools, and we're working with a local theater group, and we then take that group into the elementary school, and they present a puppet show on Yurok law stories. And the first one we did to pilot it was the story of Little Bird Who Breaks Their Wing. And the purpose of the story is that everybody has to ask for help. What do you do when you need to ask for help? How do you do it? What do you do when you're refused help? And what should the consequences be for the refusers? You know, and that works on for everybody. And we don't just go, okay, only Yurok kids are going to be in this puppet show. So we give this as a gift to the schools with a theater group. They make the show, present it to their parents at a dinner. So it's a dinner theater about this kind of thing. You know, and that's sort of trying to institutionalize it into schools and to help them figure out how to move forward. Because you can't just start at the end. You have to start and help change the context. You know, and also for us, we have to stop running and hiding, which is how we survived, which was necessary at the time. Because frankly, you know, my mantra at this point is we lived here for thousands of years. These people came in a couple hundred years that pretty well almost wrecked the place. You know, we need to get back out there and help them, or they are going to wreck the place.
So I don't have any direct experience working with kids to avoid the school to prison pipeline. I did report on that, and I went and observed some restorative justice that was being done in the Oakland Unified School District, and it was very powerful to observe. And I think Oakland has now expanded it. So I think something like 80% of the schools in Oakland are required to have some kind of restorative justice component in their schools, basically to make sure that they're not just funneling kids, suspending and expelling them, and leaving them to the tender mercies of the juvenile delinquency system. I think that the goals of restorative justice are really ultimately victim-centered, and it's about addressing the needs of the victim and the larger needs of the community. And that necessarily involves looking at who committed the harm and why, and how to prevent that from happening, and also offering some kind of reparative measures that are going to be specifically tailored to the needs of the people who were harmed. So for me, that is the most important part of restorative justice. And I think inevitably and sort of synonymously, it is about making people whole for injustices that occurred generations ago, because that's inextricably intertwined with what's happened between these people or within these communities.
So I have had experience working with the youth in the Peer Corps program I set up. And I will tell you, the kids there, they were very enthusiastic and very willing to play a role in what happens to the victim, to the defendant, and basically sending a message to the community of what a successful program would look like. So I think that's a really good start. And I think the earlier, the better that we start exposing our kids to what restorative justice looks like, the better we're able to perhaps avoid the prison pipeline. I think the ultimate goal for a restorative justice program is the community, and that it necessarily includes the victim and the defendant and the community as a whole. And I think it'll also depend on the jurisdiction you're in, the community you're in, to develop their own restorative justice program to what the community would like and to see and develop. I think the only way you can really be successful is if you really do get some buy-in from the community members. And that's where really the power is. It's with the people, and they can dictate what happens. And so I think if you put together a program that the community accepts, that is seen with success, and that it's effective, I think you'll be well on your way to having a successful program. Thank you.
Thank you. In our last 5 minutes together, I do have one more question, which Councilmember Buenaventura has once again partially answered already, which is just looking back to the beginning of your process implementing these programs. I'm just wondering if you have any advice for us, anyone who might be building out, at the early stages of implementing restorative justice in any of their communities, or even just interpersonally. If you have anything you wish you had known, or that you think is really important takeaway to remember.
I mean, I think it is knowing your community and realizing it isn't individual, it is community, because we've been taught to focus on individual rights. And I think that's a huge mistake. I think we have to focus on communities together, and how are we going to be in community? Because if you think you can just walk alone, that's not how the world is.
I think it's important for people who are going to become the next generation of lawyers and advocates to understand that there's a lot of ways in which our current system is dysfunctional and not working. And it's very important that you go into that, not just understanding that, but with ideas of how you're going to push back and fix it. And I also think that it's important to understand that the system is designed to do exactly what it does, which is incarcerate and pulverize people and perpetuate racism and mass incarceration. To undo that means going up against the status quo, and those forces are very, very deeply entrenched. And when you try to do anything disruptive to that, you're going to get a lot of pushback. You're going to get a lot of resistance. You're going to get knocked down. And my advice is really to cultivate within yourself and your communities a lot of resilience, because these reforms take time and it's not linear. You will maybe take one step forward only to be pushed 3 steps back. It's very important, I think, to always have your eye on the horizon and play the long game and think to yourself, well, it might not work this year or next year, but in 5 years or 10 years, there's going to be a sea change here, and I'm going to be part of that, even if initially it seems incredibly difficult and painful, because that's the only way meaningful change ever happens.
Yeah, so I fully agree. And I actually think that that restorative justice is not something you can ram down people's throat. It is something that people will have to understand and accept on their own. And you can help them by, for example, forwarding this Zoom webinar to people and letting them ask you questions and ask them questions like, well, could you think of something that's better than sending someone to prison? I mean, just have that dialogue. Do not be afraid of the dialogue. And you'll find that people, they want to express their opinions on issues. And if you ask them that question, then they don't know to start. And hopefully you can address what they're concerned about. I will also say that this is the time to do it because of the Black Lives Matter movement, what's happening in the country. There's a movement to change. And so this is really the time to try to make an impact and move that train forward and build on this momentum. So I'm hoping that this has served well in our discussion and that people will start talking about it more and more. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. I'm so grateful to you all for taking the time to discuss this restorative justice. And also thank you so much to the participants who've come to listen today. If there are no other questions, it doesn't look like there are. It looks like we're right at time. So I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their afternoon. Thank you so much again to the panelists. Oh, there is actually one, something that just came into the Q&A, but there is we have a comment/question that Monterey County has an organization called Restorative Justice Partners. They do a lot of work with youth in that county as well as in the schools. And so just a notification about a great resource for anyone looking to learn more about restorative justice organizations. Thank you. Great. So thank you all once again so much, and everyone have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you for having us.